Us now to discuss, Republican Senator from Arkansas, Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Senator Tom Cotton. He has a new book. It's called 7 Things You Can't Say About China, and it's out today. Thank you so much for being here, Senator. Good to see you. I'm going to get to this in a second, but I do want to get to your view of what's going on. President Zelensky of Ukraine says there's no deal without Ukrainian involvement. What do you make of what happened in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia today?
Well, I think what President Trump wanted to do is simply establish diplomatic channels with Russia to explore the contours of talks. And of course, we'll have to include President Zelensky, as President Trump himself has said, because it's a war between Ukraine and Russia. So I think this was a first step towards having talks that will hopefully bring about a lasting truce, because we've got a real mess on our hands. I mean, Joe Biden tempted Putin to invade Russia or invade Ukraine in the first place. He pussyfooted around for 3 years. And I think his ultimate strategy was to lose, but just wait until after the election to lose. This is a mess that we've all been handed. We've got to make the best of it here in America and in Ukraine and in Europe. I think that's what President Trump is going to try to do.
What do you mean he tempted Putin to invade
Well,
Ukraine?
it was just a few weeks after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that Russia began to mount forces on Ukraine's border. I think Vladimir Putin saw that Joe Biden was a weak and timid leader and that he could be taken advantage of, unlike Donald Trump. You know, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine when Barack Obama was president. He invaded when Joe Biden was president. He didn't invade when Donald Trump was president.
Do you think any normalization measures going on right now sends the wrong message to President Xi Jinping of China that you write about? The idea that you can get away with invading a sovereign nation and the United States will ultimately come and accept it?
You know, it's unfortunate we're at this point, but again, we're at this point because we inherited the mess from Joe Biden. I think it's inevitable that President Trump is going to have to negotiate with both President Putin and President Zelensky. His team is going to have to negotiate with both of those men's teams as well. That may not have been the case back in 2022 if we had just allowed Ukraine to win fast at the very beginning of this war. But right now it's inevitable that we have to sit down and have these negotiations, just like Ronald Reagan sat down multiple times with Mikhail Gorbachev. You know, 4 times in 3 years they had a summit. It was just between the two of them. He didn't have all of NATO leaders there. They exchanged 40 different letters. Reagan even said he developed a bond and friendship with Gorbachev. So I think it's inevitable that you have to take these steps to establish diplomatic channels and actually get to a lasting truce that protects Ukraine's future and, as J.D. Vance said last week, in Europe, its sovereign independence.
You know that even your fellow Republican, Senator Wicker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, criticized the Secretary of Defense last week for basically giving up a number of concessions, including territorial concessions in Ukraine, NATO membership Ukraine membership in NATO. In 2022, you mentioned you made a direct tie between American concessions to Russia and what you feared would be the wrong message China would take when it came to Taiwan. Take a listen.
It's not just Vladimir Putin and Europe that's watching. The rest of the world is watching, and most particularly Xi Jinping is watching what happens in Ukraine. And if he sees the United States and the West faltering after a few months and pressing Ukraine to sue for peace while Russian troops are still on Ukrainian soil, he is much more likely to go for the jugular in Taiwan.
Do you worry at all that the concessions being dangled in front of Putin right now are more likely to make President Xi Jinping go for the jugular in Taiwan today, as you were concerned in 2022?
Well, circumstances have changed since 2022. They've changed primarily on the battlefield. Ukraine had a chance to actually win back in 2022, and Joe Biden didn't allow them to. And we have a different president here in the United States. And Vladimir Putin recognizes that. I think he respects and in some ways fears Donald Trump in the way he did in Barack Obama and Joe Biden. That's why we didn't have an invasion of Ukraine in Donald Trump's first term. But that's the case in all wars. Wars change, circumstances change, and what you might be able to get in terms of concessions from your adversary at one stage of the war is different from a later stage.
So the book, we have now segued to your book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China, and it's a very hawkish book. I disagree with very little of it myself personally, but talking about China. China's an evil empire. China's preparing for war. China's waging an economic world war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things you talk about, you're very critical of corporations willing to do business, kowtowing, for want of a better word, before the Chinese government. You write in your book, the Chinese communists covet Taiwan not merely to right a perceived but parochial historical wrong. They know that control of Taiwan would put China on the path to global dominance over the United States. And here's what Elon Musk said in 2023 in an interview with CNBC on this subject.
The official policy of China is that Taiwan should be integrated. One does not need to read between the lines. One can simply read the lines.
Do you think that...
So I think there's some inevitability to the situation.
Do you have any concerns about Elon Musk, who has a lot of business interests in China? Obviously, you mention him in the book as being one of many people, along with Mark Zuckerberg and others, that you feel you have issues with how nice they've been to China. Do you have any concerns about him being such a close advisor with President Trump?
No, I don't. I mean, I wish that Tesla didn't have those big operations in China, but I wish the same of Ford and Coca-Cola and Apple and Caterpillar and a lot of American corporations. That's really just been the story of China's economic world war over the last several decades of attracting all those companies into China, and in some ways, America making it easy for them to go to China. But what Elon Musk said about Taiwan is true. That's very clear. That's their stated policy, is that they want to annex and unify Taiwan back to the mainland. What's also true is the United States has said, at least going back to the 1970s, in the Taiwan Relation Act and across administrations of both parties, is that we will only support the stable, peaceful status quo about the Taiwan Strait. We will not support a forceful change to that status quo. That may not be satisfactory to all parties, but it's worked so far, and I think it can continue to work if America is strong and resolute, helping Taiwan build up its military and building up our own military so we can deter a conflict over China. Because there'll be no winners if there's a conflict over Taiwan. If China goes for the jugular and the United States stands back and doesn't aid Taiwan, or we come to Taiwan's aid, again, there'll be no winners. As Churchill said about war in the last century, the victors suffer almost as much as the vanquished. So the only way we can prevail is not to fight in the first place, by being strong and resolute and maintaining the peaceful status quo across the strait.
But do you think that President Trump will maintain, at the very least, the strategic ambiguity about whether or not the U.S. would ever militarily assist Taiwan if it were attacked, as opposed to, like him or hate him, you obviously have your issues with him, President Biden said, he wasn't very ambiguous. He was asked one time in Japan, I think it was, would we send troops? And he said yes. He kind of like threw away the strategic ambiguity.
Well, unfortunately, he did it 4 times in about 13 months, and all 4 times either he reversed himself or other White House aides reversed him.
Right.
So I guess you had ambiguous strategic ambiguity, which is maybe the worst of both possible worlds. Now, look, in his first term, President Trump maintained that longstanding policy of strategic ambiguity. He helped Taiwan build up its defenses. He built up our defensive. I have no reason to think that he's not going to do the exact same thing. I think success for President Trump and the Trump administration on China would be that they hand off the football to the next administration 4 years from now. We're stronger, Taiwan is stronger, and there's been no conflict over Taiwan.
All right. Senator Tom Cotton, the new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. It's out today. Senator Tom Cotton from the great state of Arkansas. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Coming up next, new